My name is Allan Billington. It was a Thursday morning, the 1st of April, 1999. My wife and kids were on a mini vacation at a beach house in Florida. I'd have loved to have gone with them, but it was tax time, and I was a tax accountant. I didn't mind the work so much since it was really only a few months out of the year that I had to put in such long hours. On this particular day, I'd gone from early to late working on an account. I went to bed exhausted. Yet I couldn't quite sleep through the night. I looked at the clock at one point, 3 a.m., much too early to get up. I tried to go back to sleep. I might have succeeded if not for the sound of branches against my bedroom window. The wind was picking up outside. Alternately, it slapped the branches on the window pane and then dragged them off in an irregular rhythm. I'd been meaning to trim that tree ever since the leaves returned. I tried blocking it out, but I couldn't. I got up and walked downstairs to the kitchen. To avoid blinding myself with the overhead light, I opted for the stove light. I put the kettle on to make some coffee. If you're not going to sleep, you might as well make it official. Besides, I figured since I was up, I could get an early jump on the day's work. While I was waiting for the kettle to boil, I ground some coffee and glanced toward the kitchen window. I heard a low rumble and then a spatter of light rain. In the black window pane, I only saw my own reflection staring back at me. It wasn't a flattering picture. Tired, balding, looking like I needed a few more hours of sleep. It's funny, I remember looking at the bags under my eyes and thinking just for a moment about a commercial for some moisturizer I'd seen on TV the week before. Strange that I remember that. As I looked disapprovingly at myself, the backyard security light flickered on and off, only then giving me a clear view of the yard and of the weather. This didn't concern me at first because the security light would often go on and off with the passage of a deer or some other forest creature. We lived on 15 acres of land back then, right at the edge of a national forest. I finished making the coffee and poured myself a cup. That's when the backyard security light came on again, and this time it stayed on. I looked lazily out the window, which was spotty now with raindrops. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was old, with long gray hair that hung wetly over her shoulders and onto her lap. She was wearing a colorless shirt with no sleeves and a long skirt that billowed in the wind. She sat perfectly still on my children's swing set, on the right-hand swing. Her arms held high, fingers wrapped around the chains. I had no idea who she was or where she'd come from or why she was in my backyard. My eyes were drawn to her arms. There was something off about them. They were much too long, stretching a good 5 feet from where she sat. For an instant I had the impression of 2 boa constrictors wrapping themselves around the plastic-coated chains as they moved upward. I jumped, and my coffee mug hit the floor, breaking into 2 large pieces, gushing hot liquid across my bare feet. In pain, I looked down quickly, and then back up as the security lights in the backyard went off. All I could see again was the darkness outside, and my dim reflection staring back at me. It had all happened so fast. I remember thinking, okay, 3 options here. Number 1, it wasn't real. She was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe I'm sleepwalking or dreaming. Number 2, there really was an old woman out there, but her arms were not that long, made to appear unnaturally long by the water dripping down the window pane. And 3, there was an old woman out there with impossibly long arms. I stepped over the broken pieces of the mug towards a sliding outer door, cupped my hands against the glass, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. I could hear the wind and the rain falling lightly on my wooden deck. I made sure the door was locked and then threw the switch on the backyard light. I walked back to the kitchen window and peered out again. No one. The swing where the old woman had sat was moving. But so was the other one. The wind, I thought. I must have stood at the window for 5, maybe 10 minutes. I was utterly still, barely breathing. Eventually I turned away, cleaned up the coffee mess on the floor, and headed back to my bedroom. As I showered and dressed for work, I kept an eye on the windows facing the back of the house, but there was nothing there. It was still much too early to go to the office, but I was restless and didn't relish hanging around the house alone, so I climbed into the car and took off. I got a breakfast sandwich from a 24-hour drive-through diner and then parked outside my office to eat it. The car was warm, and I didn't feel like stepping back into the rain just yet. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was a knock on my car window. It was Sandy, one of my seasonal employees. I wound down the window in a haze, pretending she'd only caught me resting my eyes. "Hey," she said, one eyebrow a bit higher than the other. "Sorry to bother you. It's 9:10. Sandy was a good woman. Attractive in her mid-30s, with bright orange hair and slightly overpronounced makeup. She had large, expressive brown eyes under bangs that covered half her face. She was a single mom, doing her best. She could only afford a babysitter for several hours a day, so at tax time, her son, Billy, would end up at the office till late at night when Sandy finished her shift. Billy was a quiet boy, so it was never an issue. He'd usually just sit coloring in an empty cubicle. That was a long day. My head was soon too deep in tax forms to think about what had happened the night before. I met with my last client at around 8 p.m., answered a few emails, and then shut down my computer. As I got into my car, I noticed a piece of folded paper under the wiper. At first, I thought it was a ticket or something. I got out of the car, lifted the wiper, and retrieved it. On unfolding it, I discovered a black crayon drawing of a woman with strangely long arms. She was standing with her arms at her side, her elbows at her feet, and the rest of her arms stretching out toward the viewer, palms and fingers up. There was no doubting the woman in the drawing. She was the one I'd seen on my children's swing set the night before. Who'd put this drawing on my car? Then it occurred to me. Billy. Sandy's car, usually parked next to mine, had already left the parking lot. I called her cell. She answered, and I very gently explained to her what I'd found. I didn't want her to think I was mad at Billy, but I had to know more. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She took a deep breath before she spoke. "Billy? Allan, I don't know what you're looking at, but Billy draws much happier things. Besides, why would he leave anything under your windshield wiper?" "You're a bad liar, Sandy," I said. I tried not to sound accusatory. "Tell me what's going on." "Sandy, you can tell me." I heard her sigh deeply, and then the truth came spilling out. "Ugh, Allan, I'm so sorry. Yes, it must have been Billy. I don't know what to tell you. Over the last couple of weeks, he's been having nightmares about a woman he calls Lady Long. He's so distracted. I can get him to surface for a brief while, and then he takes off for his bedroom and wants to be alone." At the words, Lady Long, I shuddered involuntarily. I'd been propping the car door open with my foot to keep the car light on. I brought my leg inside, shut the door, and locked the car instinctively. "Allan?" Sandy was still on the phone and waiting for a response. I knew she'd been feeling the pressures of single parenthood for a few months now, ever since her husband had left her. I didn't want to add to her concern, so I decided not to tell her about my visit from the woman Billy was calling Lady Long. "It's okay, Sandy. Whatever is happening with Billy, I'm sure it'll be fine. He's a great kid. They go through phases, you know. I've raised a few of my own. Why don't you take tomorrow off, get some rest?" Allan, it's the busiest time of year for us. We'll survive. We always do. Take some time for yourself and your son. And to address her unspoken concern, I added, we'll call it a sick day, so you'll still get paid. I ended the call and started the car. When I got home, I made myself some dinner and talked with my wife and children. Hearing their voices on the phone made me feel normal again. They were having a great time in sunny Florida. I didn't tell my wife anything that had happened. The last thing I wanted was to ruin their holiday. That evening, I avoided looking out any of the windows as I made my way to bed. Thankfully, I fell asleep quickly. Around 3 a.m., I heard the branches slapping at the window again. My first thought on waking was, I've got to cut that tree down, or trim it back at least. In a repeat of the previous night's activities, I got up and went into the kitchen, turned on the stove light, and flicked on the kettle. I ground some fresh coffee beans and removed a mug from the drying rack on the sink. I opened the fridge to get some creamer and then closed the door, deciding to have my coffee black. Among these mundane tasks, my eyes drifted to the window that looked out into the yard. In the blackness of night, my face with its sunken eyes stared back at me from the window. No security light tonight. I closed the window blinds. The kettle flicked off, having boiled, and I finished making my coffee. I was sitting in the living room, adjacent to the kitchen, about to take my first sip when the room became slightly brighter. The security light outside had come on. Lines of light were peeking through the bottom of the window blinds. I don't know where I got the courage, but instead of peering through the blinds, I quickly slid open the back door and poked my neck outside, trying to catch a glimpse of that woman on the swing set. I saw what I was looking for. She was there again. Her body still, her skirt rising and falling in the wind, and her long arms snaking up the chains of the swing until they hung over the wooden horizontal beam. Her large eyes turned towards me, round and white balls, as if the skin around them were being peeled back. The huge dark pupils focused on and bore into me. She started moving her legs back and forth. My God, she was swinging. I let out a short scream and slammed the door, frantically locking it in one fluid motion. It took me a while before my breathing calmed, and another little while to build up the courage to open the blinds. She was gone. Just an empty swing moving back and forth in the breeze. I made my way to the computer desk in my bedroom. Maybe the internet had some answers for me, the local community message board. I tried to find any mention of this lady from others in my area. The night was well spent by the time I looked up from the computer, but I had found nothing to satisfy or console me. I crawled into bed for the last couple of hours of the night, wishing the sun were already up. At the first glimpse of light, I got up and walked out on the back porch. I took a good look up and down the yard. The morning air was cool. The grass and the shrubbery were wet from the previous night's rain, but the sky was clear. It was going to be a beautiful spring day. I moved with determination toward the swing set. I disconnected both swings from the wooden frame and then walked around to the front of the house, where I threw both of them onto the back seat of my car. Later that morning, I dropped them into the dumpster, out in back of the building where I worked. Paying attention at work that day was nearly impossible. To my surprise, Sandy came in. She thanked me for our phone call. She said she was feeling better, but worked with her head down all day. I realized around lunch that I was waiting to see Billy that evening. When he did come in, he seemed very sad, and if possible, quieter than usual. I said hello to him and gave Sandy a big smile, as if to say, I won't be interrogating your son when you go back to work. But I did, playing good cop, of course. I approached the cubicle he was coloring in and dropped down to a squat in front of him. I showed him the drawing he'd left on my windshield and asked him who it was. I chose my words carefully. Lady Long? What does she do? No response. Billy was now frantically coloring on a sheet of white paper, using only black. Billy? Billy? He ignored me. Billy? I raised my voice this time, demanding an answer. I stood up in my anger and accidentally knocked his coloring book on the blue carpeted floor. Dozens of pictures of this Lady Long fanned out all over the office floor and under the desk. The other half of the drawings were the same as the one Billy was working on, completely black. There was something mesmerizing about them. For some reason, I had a hard time looking away. Billy didn't move to pick up his scattered art. He continued coloring. It wasn't until Sandy came into the cubicle that I composed myself. I bent down and started to collect the drawings to give them back to him. I apologized to Billy for raising my voice. On seeing the drawings, Sandy began to cry. We moved out of the cubicle to the office lounge. I poured some coffee for her. She took the cup and sipped it, trying to calm herself. As I recounted to her, in as low a voice as possible so that Billy wouldn't overhear, my experience with the woman Billy called Lady Long. She's real, I said. She was in my backyard, sitting on my kid's swing. I don't know who or what she is, maybe just a homeless woman? What if she's trying to hurt him? Sandy asked me, her fidgety hands knocking her cup against its saucer. I realized my idea about calming her was having the opposite effect, so I changed tack. You should go to the police with Billy. Let them know that this woman is stalking him. Stalking? Sandy shot a look at me, eyes wide and concerned. A voice came from the cubicle a few feet away. Mom, are we going soon? Maybe he'd heard the whole thing. Sandy likely had that thought too, so when she stood up, she'd forgotten about the saucer, which fell to the floor, and in reaching for it, she accidentally spilled her coffee in my lap. Thankfully, it wasn't too hot. On the drive home, I debated telling my wife everything. But again, I didn't. I decided to wait at least one more day, wanting to catch this woman, maybe, or report her officially. I guess that's why I went back. I expected to see her again. Just a homeless old lady, I kept trying to tell myself. When I woke up around the same time on the third consecutive night, I resolved not to get up. I'd spent most of the previous 2 nights in wide-eyed terror. My body was starting to feel the strain. I guess you can get to the point physically when numbness replaces fear. As I lay in bed, eyes wide open at the ceiling, it occurred to me that all I had to do was open that window and break off the nearest branch. No branch, no noise. Sleep. But I felt too tired to even do that, so I closed my eyes. But sleep wasn't going to happen this night. I sighed and leaned over, gently pulling the string on the nightstand lamp. My face stretched into a yawn as I flipped my legs over the bed. I had a second urge to make some coffee. I heard a small squeaking sound, like sneakers on a basketball court. Looking down at the floor, I saw 2 very long arms stretched straight out from under my bed, palms up, like they were ready to catch me. I screamed and threw myself over to the other side of the bed. My eyes darted around the room for a path of escape. My car keys were on the bureau. As I ran past, I grabbed them and then ran from the house. I jumped into my car, locked myself in, started the engine, and backed out frantically. Using my cell, I called the police and asked for someone to come out and just take a look around the front and backyards. I told them I thought I'd seen someone out there. I don't know why I didn't tell them she was in my house. I headed over to Sandy's place, on the other side of the forest, about a 10-minute drive. Maybe if we put our heads together, we could figure out what was going on. Arriving at Sandy's, I noticed the lights were on. They should have been out for the night. I rang the bell and rang it again. No answer. I started to knock on the door, but it swung open. I stepped into the house and called first for Sandy and then for Billy. No answer. I sensed some activity up on the second floor. I rushed upstairs, taking 2 or 3 steps at a time. At the top, something out of the corner of my eye grabbed my attention. I turned my head very slowly. A bedroom door was opened, but all I could see was black. As I moved into the room, I could see that everything had been colored in with black crayon from carpet to ceiling. I heard Sandy crying, begging Billy to stop. I walked into what should have been a little boy's room with posters of hockey players and a floor rug showing Super Mario's smiling face. Instead, the walls and even the ceiling had been scribbled into oblivion. Sandy was on the floor in front of Billy. He was dragging the crayon over the wall near the bottom corner of the room. "Billy, you have to stop," Sandy pleaded, tugging at his arm. But he wasn't paying attention. He was coloring frantically and singing softly to himself. I later discovered that it was a nursery rhyme. Here's part of what he was singing. "Oh, where have you been, Billy boy, Billy boy? Oh, where have you been, charming Billy? I have been to seek a wife. She's the joy of my life. She's a very old thing and cannot leave her mother. Did she bid you to come in, Billy boy, Billy boy? Did she bid you to come in, charming Billy? Yes, she bade me to come in. There's a dimple in her chin. She's a very old thing and cannot leave her mother." Sandy suddenly looked up, noticing me. Only instead of surprise, she looked mournfully at me and held out her hand. Together we knelt at either side of Billy. We convinced him to stop singing and coloring and come with us out of the room. We headed downstairs to the living room. The police called my cell a few minutes later to let me know they'd found nothing out of the ordinary around my house. They were polite, but I could tell they weren't too happy about being called out for nothing, especially since I wasn't even there to greet them. I thanked them and ended the call. Sandy asked what had happened. I told her. "Who is this woman, Allan? Why is she doing this?" As she spoke, she brushed the hair from Billy's brow. He was lying on the couch. Whatever had taken hold of him, he was out of its grip from the moment as he fell asleep. "You can't go back to your house," she said quietly, looking up at me. "You can stay here in the guest room." I didn't have to be told twice. The next morning came quickly. Another night without sleep left me feeling strangely disconnected from the world. I couldn't lose a day of work, though. Before leaving, I told Sandy I'd hire a cleaner to get rid of the black crayon on the walls. She pressed my hand and held it. I left her in the front doorway and watched her get smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror as I pulled out and started down the road. It was a long day at my desk. I was suffering from sleep deprivation, and though I'd been able to shower at Sandy's, I didn't have a clean change of clothes. When I look back now, I wish to God that I'd never left Sandy's house. Around mid-afternoon at work, I got another call from the police. At first I thought they were following up on their visit to my house the night before, but no. They were asking me to stop in at the station. They had some questions for me about Sandy and Billy. They wouldn't give me any details over the phone. I dropped what I was doing immediately and headed over. The officer at the front desk took me to one of the interrogation rooms, where I was joined a few minutes later by a detective and her partner. I felt like even if I had told them the truth, the whole truth, that they would never believe me. They had some questions for me about my visit to Sandy's. Had I noticed anyone hanging around the place? Was there anything out of the ordinary? When I pressed them on the reason for their questions, they looked at each other for a moment and then gave me the horrible news. Billy had been found in his backyard that afternoon, strangled to death. The detectives did not suspect me of the murder since I'd been at work all day, but they knew I'd spent the night at Sandy's after fleeing my own situation. They hoped I'd seen something. Certainly I had. The boy's room turned inside out, saturated in a black abyss. But how would that help their investigation? My first thought went to Sandy. If only I had stayed with them. As I got back into my car, I was seized by a fear for my own family. What if they hadn't gone on vacation? Would this woman have killed one of them? So finally I decided to call my wife and tell her what had happened to Billy. For some reason I left out my encounters with Lady Long. I felt like I had to keep this secret from her. Besides, I still didn't want my family coming home just yet. I had to go back to the house alone first. I prepared for bed in a different frame of mind than the previous 3 nights. I knew Lady Long was coming. I expected her. With little emotion, I followed the normal routine. I locked up the house, turned off the lights, and closed the kitchen window shades that looked over the backyard. I changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed after checking underneath it. An outside observer would have noticed nothing different about my behavior. But inside, a steely determination had set in. In a strange state of calm, I fell asleep. Right on schedule, around 3 a.m, the branches outside my window began to dance and scrape against the glass. I woke from my shallow sleep and listened for a moment. Then I rose, threw on my robe, and headed to the window. I undid the lock and put some force into raising the pane. The undulating branches outside came through the open space. I could hear behind them a strong wind and the movement of the other branches on the tree. Anger fueled me as I grabbed hold of the branches and snapped them off one by one so they would fall short of the window. Most of them were thin and easy to bend and break. One, however, was thicker. I found it to be a dead limb. It cracked as I applied pressure to it. The smaller branches I let fall to the ground, but this solid stake I took into the house. I felt stronger holding it. In fact, the effort of removing the branches gave me, for the first time in days, a feeling of empowerment. I closed the window and watched the branches sway without making any contact at all. I headed to the kitchen, tossing the tree branch on the island, and set the water to boil. I ground some fresh coffee, found a mug. As I went through these motions, I was sensitive to every sound within and without the house. After taking a sip of the hot coffee, I felt ready for the next step. I went over to the kitchen window and boldly pulled up the shades. The light from the kitchen settled on the backyard and the empty swing set frame. She wasn't there. When I turned from the window back to the kitchen, my heart stopped. I found myself standing in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee in my hand, and in front of me, spread out all over the kitchen counter and shelves, were all the coffee mugs and glasses we owned. Pots and pans, too, were here and there, as if some invisible hand had emptied the cupboards. And all of them, every glass and mug and pot, were filled to the brims with black coffee. I noticed, too, that the kitchen was no longer filled with the yellow glow of the stove light. It was blazing bright with the white, silvery reflection of a full moon that had broken free of the night's clouds. 2 pale hands appeared, floating through the doorway to the living room, their pointed fingers stretched out stiffly. They moved toward me on motley, veiny arms like 2 long snake heads suspended in the air. Looking down the length of those ghastly arms, I saw her, head bent and large eyes glaring at me from under matted gray hair. No sooner did I take all of this in than she leapt like a spider, her hands wrapping tightly around my throat. I felt each finger dig into my flesh as I was lifted into the air and pressed backward over the kitchen island. As the hands squeezed more tightly around my neck, I flailed, stretching my arms wide like a man drowning in a pool. I felt the top of the branch on the island brush up against my right hand. I grabbed it and brought it down as hard as I could on the arms holding me. I grew frantic, slamming the branch down again and again, but the hands continued to hold me. I turned the branch over in my hand and stabbed deep into the right arm of my attacker. Release was immediate. I fell to the kitchen floor, wheezing for breath. Crawling, I made my way across the wooden floorboards, then up the carpeted steps and onto my bedroom floor. I cowered in the corner of the room, clutching the saving branch. For a moment, everything was still. I inched slowly toward the bedroom window, thinking maybe I could connect with the tree outside, climb down, and then run like hell. But just as I gripped the window, I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping. Something was slapping the floor as it moved down the hallway. I froze and looked toward the bedroom door. She stood there, her arms hanging at her side. They began to move, following the floor and then climbing the walls as if she intended to fill every square inch of the room with her arms. They were coming for me again. I opened the window so hard and fast that it broke, glass shattering everywhere. I pushed myself past the broken shards, through the frame, heedless of the gashes to my body as I reached and ultimately dove for the large tree just below the window. Clutching it, I slid down the trunk and toppled to the ground. I ran and ran, stumbling and getting up again. For a long, long time, I don't remember stopping. I was found later that morning, deep in the heart of the forest, by a man walking his dog. He told the paramedics that I was slouched against a tree, completely unresponsive, but singing gently about a very old woman who could not leave her mother. They got me to the emergency room and contacted my family. When I finally came to, my wife was sitting beside me, holding my hand. For a full year after these events, I had the marks of those long fingers wrapped around my neck like some kind of awful souvenir. I spent thousands of dollars on doctors and dermatologists. I gave myself rashes from scratching at the marks. I scratched until they bled. I finally stopped myself from scratching by wearing scarves, and when I went out in public, turtlenecks. Eventually the rashes healed, but the marks remained. The inner wounds were another matter. Every time I looked in the mirror, I was reminded of the horrors I had experienced. When my wife suggested a vacation in Florida, I gladly agreed. In fact, it was on that vacation that I found a permanent solution for the marks on my neck. When I showed up for my appointment at Red Carpet Tattoo, the woman asked me what I wanted. Something to feel at home in, I said. In the 10 centimeters between my chin and collarbone, twisting all the way around to the top of my spine. Black ink. It took 12 hours to shade in.